Fly to Geneva, the 4-star general told me at my father's grave. Give them your father's name. They'll understand. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The wind moved across Arlington National Cemetery like it owned the place, bending the small American flags planted beside the rows of white marble stones. It was cold, quiet, and strangely empty. My father had been buried less than 30 minutes earlier. No long line of mourners. No speeches about heroism. No slideshow of medals or military honors. Just a folded American flag placed carefully into my hands, and my father's name carved into stone. He had been a retired Navy SEAL, but if you had known him the way I did, you never would have guessed it. There were no medals hanging on the walls of his house. No framed photos from deployments. No stories about combat or missions. He fixed fences, paid his bills early, and drank his coffee every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. After retiring, he worked part-time at a marine supply store near the harbor in Norfolk. He used to joke that he liked the smell of rope and salt. That was the man I knew. Quiet. Simple. Predictable. He lived that way for decades. And when he died the same way. Quietly. A heart attack in his kitchen. A neighbor found him 2 days later when he didn't answer the door. No fortune. No second property. No secret accounts that anyone knew about. At least, that's what I thought. The general standing in front of me looked down at the headstone for a moment before speaking again. I served with your father, he said. That alone surprised me. My father had never mentioned serving with anyone who reached the rank of 4-star general. Then the general looked back at me, his expression calm, almost procedural. Fly to Geneva, he repeated. Give them your father's name. They'll understand. He handed me a plain white card. No insignia. No title. Just a phone number with a Swiss country code, and a last name written neatly in blue ink. Before I could ask a single question, he gave a small nod and walked away between the rows of headstones. I stood there for a long time holding that card in my hand, the wind moving through the cemetery around me. Because in that moment, I realized something I had never considered before. My father hadn't died with nothing. He had died with instructions. And whatever he had been building all those quiet years had just become my responsibility. I didn't tell Michael about the card. Not that afternoon. Not that night. When I left Arlington, I drove straight back to my father's house in Norfolk, the same small 3-bedroom place he'd lived in for nearly 30 years. The house looked exactly the way it always had. Nothing about it suggested international banking, secret accounts, or anything that required a flight to Switzerland. His truck was still parked in the driveway, a 12-year-old Ford with a dent in the rear bumper and a fishing sticker peeling off the back window. Inside, the house smelled the same as it always had. Old Spice, motor oil, fresh coffee. My father had routines the way some people have hobbies. His boots sat beside the door, lined up perfectly with the wall. His coffee mug, white with a small crack near the handle, hung on the same hook it had hung from for years. 6 o'clock every morning. Black coffee, no sugar. For a long moment, I just stood there holding the card the general had given me. A Swiss phone number. A last name written neatly in blue ink. That was it. No explanation. No instructions. Just fly to Geneva. I slipped the card into my pocket and walked slowly through the house, the way you do after someone dies, half expecting them to step out of the next room and tell you you're looking through things you shouldn't be touching. I started in the kitchen. Bills stacked neatly beside the toaster. Utility statements. Receipts from the hardware store down on Hampton Boulevard. Nothing unusual. Nothing secret. My father believed in paying things early. He once told me late fees were a tax on impatience. The living room was the same story. A worn couch. 2 fishing magazines on the end table. The same old television he refused to replace even when the screen started showing a faint blue line across the bottom. No medals. No shadow boxes. No framed photos from deployments. If you walked through that house without knowing better, you would have assumed he'd lived an ordinary life. For years, that's exactly what I believed. Then I opened the closet in his bedroom. At first, it looked the same as everything else: shirts pressed neatly, 2 jackets hanging in plastic covers, a pair of running shoes he probably hadn't worn in a decade. But on the floor in the back corner was a weathered shoebox, the kind old men use to store things they don't want to throw away. I almost didn't open it. Something about it felt private. But curiosity has a way of pushing past respect when someone is gone. Inside the box were 3 things: an old photograph, a stack of folded documents, and a passport. I picked it up slowly. The cover was worn soft at the edges, the way leather gets after years of being carried in a jacket pocket. My father hated flying. Or at least, that's what he always said. But when I opened the passport, I felt something shift inside my chest. The pages were thick with stamps. Switzerland, France, Germany. Dates going back almost 20 years. Trip after trip. Year after year. I sat down on the edge of his bed and flipped through the pages again, slower this time. None of those trips had ever come up in conversation. Not once. When I visited on Sundays, we talked about weather, fishing, baseball scores, and which neighbor had let their grass grow too high. Never Geneva. Never Europe. Never Switzerland. I looked around the small bedroom again, the same one he'd slept in since I was in high school. The same dresser. The same lamp. The same quiet life. And suddenly it didn't feel quite as simple as it had that morning. Because the man I thought I understood had apparently been crossing the Atlantic for 2 decades. Without telling anyone, without changing anything about the way he lived, I turned the Swiss phone number card over in my hand again. Then I looked down at the passport, and for the first time since the funeral, I started to wonder if the general hadn't been exaggerating at all. Maybe my father hadn't died with nothing. Maybe he had just spent his entire life making sure no one noticed what he was building. For a long time, I just sat there on the edge of my father's bed, the passport in one hand and that white card in the other. Switzerland. Geneva. The same place the general had told me to fly. I flipped through the passport again, slower this time. The stamps weren't random. Most of them were spaced months apart, sometimes a year, but they stretched back almost 2 decades. 20 years. My father had been crossing the Atlantic without saying a word about it. And somehow, he had done it while living the most ordinary life imaginable in a quiet Norfolk neighborhood. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. Nothing about his life suggested money. He drove a 12-year-old truck, clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, and once drove across town just to save 12 cents on gas. So what was he doing in Switzerland? I looked down at the card again. A Swiss phone number. A single last name written in careful handwriting. No bank logo, no company name, nothing. Just a number. I'm not the kind of person who chases mystery. My job at the shipping company is compliance rules, documentation, making sure every form lines up with the right regulation. My life has always been predictable. But something about the way the general said it at Arlington didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural. Like he was handing me instructions that had been waiting a long time. So the next morning I called the number. The woman who answered spoke calm, precise English with the faintest European accent. "Good morning," she said. I hesitated for half a second before giving my father's name. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Long enough that I almost wondered if the call had dropped. Then she said something that made my pulse slow down instead of speed up. "Yes," she said quietly, "we have been expecting you." Not surprised. Not confused. Expecting. She asked when I could travel to Geneva. I told her I would need a few days. "That is perfectly understandable," she replied. "When you arrive, please bring identification and a copy of the death certificate." That was it. No mention of accounts. No talk of money. Just calm instructions. 3 days later, I was sitting on a plane crossing the Atlantic, staring out the window at 30,000 feet of empty sky, and wondering how my father, who hated flying, or at least claimed he did, had done this trip over and over again for 20 years. Geneva wasn't what I expected. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet. Clean streets. Gray winter sky. The lake sitting still, under a cold wind coming down from the mountains. The cab ride from the airport took maybe 20 minutes. Narrow streets, old stone buildings, everything orderly in a way that almost felt deliberate. The bank building itself didn't look impressive at all. No gold signs, no dramatic entrance. Just glass, stone, and a small plaque beside the door. Inside, everything moved slowly and quietly. Polished wood floors. Soft lighting. The kind of place where people spoke in calm voices even when no one asked them to. At the reception desk, I gave them my father's name. The woman didn't react at all. She simply picked up the phone and spoke quietly in French. A few minutes later, a man in a dark suit appeared from the hallway. "Miss Parker?" he asked. "Yes." "Please come with me." We walked down a corridor that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. No dramatic vault doors. No guards with earpieces. Just quiet offices behind heavy doors. He led me into a private room and closed the door gently behind us. Then he sat down across the desk and folded his hands. "I am very sorry for your loss," he said. Then he looked directly at me. "Your father was a very disciplined man." That word caught my attention immediately. Disciplined. Not wealthy. Not successful. Disciplined. He opened a folder on the desk. Inside were documents. And my father's signature. Dated more than 20 years earlier. That was the moment I realized something important. Whatever my father had been doing in Switzerland, he hadn't just started it recently. He had been building it quietly for most of my adult life. The banker turned the folder toward me so I could see the documents more clearly. My father's signature appeared again and again across the page's steady block letters, the same handwriting I remembered from grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator door. Dates stretched back more than 20 years. Consistent deposits, investment summaries, transfer confirmations. I frowned slightly, trying to piece it together. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "What exactly is this?" The man folded his hands calmly on the desk. "In 2002, your father established a trust through our institution," he explained. "It has been maintained with consistent contributions and long-term investment growth." A trust. The word felt oddly formal compared to the life my father had lived. "My father worked part-time at a marine supply store," I said. "He drove a 12-year-old truck." The banker gave a polite nod, the kind of expression someone uses when they already know the answer you're about to discover. "Yes," he said. "He was a very disciplined man." He slid another sheet across the desk. Columns of numbers filled the page. Account balances. Investment growth. Disbursements. For a moment, the numbers didn't register at all. My brain simply refused to organize them into something meaningful. Then my eyes landed on the final figure. $12,594,628. I blinked once. Then again. "I think there must be some mistake," I said quietly. "There is no mistake," the banker replied. He didn't sound dramatic, just certain. $12 million, I repeated, almost to myself. He nodded slightly. "The trust is currently valued at just over $12 million US. I leaned back in the chair slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. My father's house in Norfolk had a mortgage that had taken him 30 years to pay off. He once spent 20 minutes arguing with a cashier over a $2 overcharge at the hardware store. $12 million didn't belong anywhere in that picture. "How?" I asked. The banker opened another document. "Long-term investments," he said. "Conservative ones, compounded over time. Your father made steady contributions for many years." That word again. Steady. He tapped one section of the report. He also declined multiple opportunities to withdraw funds for personal use. I looked back down at the numbers. 20 years of discipline. 20 years of saying no to things most people would have taken. "But why Switzerland?" I asked. "Privacy," he answered simply. And stability. Then he opened another folder. This, he said, sliding it toward me, is the purpose of the trust. Inside were summaries. Short descriptions, carefully anonymized. A widow in Texas whose mortgage had been paid when her husband died from complications related to his service. A former Marine in Arizona whose medical treatments had been partially funded after the VA denied coverage. Tuition payments for a daughter whose father had suffered a stroke after years of exposure to burn pits overseas. I read through 3 pages before I finally looked up. He was helping people, I said quietly. Yes. All this time. Yes. The banker folded his hands again. Your father designated the trust specifically to support former service members and their families during times of hardship. I felt something tighten in my chest. He had never mentioned any of this. Not once. Not during Sunday dinners. Not during the quiet afternoons when we sat on his porch watching boats move slowly across the bay. You don't advertise help, the banker said, almost as if quoting something. I froze slightly. Those were my father's words. Or close enough. You just provide it. The banker nodded once. That was very much his philosophy. I sat there for a long moment staring at the documents. My father had lived in a modest house. Driven an old truck. Worked a part-time job he didn't even need. And all that time he had been quietly building a $12 million safety net for people most of the country would never even hear about. Finally, I asked the question that had been forming in the back of my mind since the moment the banker opened the folder. What happens now? He looked directly at me. Now, he said calmly, you assume oversight. Me? Yes. He slid one final document across the desk. Your father named you as the successor trustee. I stared at the paper for a long moment. $12 million. Not an inheritance. A responsibility. I kept staring at the document in front of me. Successor trustee. My name was printed neatly beneath the title, the same way it might appear on a mortgage agreement or a work contract, clean, official, impossible to misunderstand. This means I manage it? I asked slowly. Yes, the banker said. Upon your father's passing, all oversight transfers to you. I looked down again at the numbers in the folder. $12 million sitting quietly in accounts I had never heard of, built piece by piece over 20 years while my father lived in the same modest house and drank the same $6 grocery store coffee. This isn't exactly my field, I said. He gave a small, understanding nod. Your father anticipated that concern. From another section of the folder, he pulled a thin packet and placed it beside the trust agreement. Administrative support will remain here in Geneva. Our office manages the investment side, tax reporting, and distribution logistics. Your role is oversight. Oversight, I repeated. Yes, he said. You review requests, approve distributions, and ensure the trust continues to follow your father's intent. Intent. That word felt heavier than the money. I flipped through a few more pages in the packet. There were summaries of the beneficiaries again. Anonymous identifiers rather than names, families receiving assistance with hospital bills, veterans needing help after losing jobs, a few college tuition payments for children whose parents had served with my father. My father had never mentioned any of them. Not once. How many people does this help? I asked. Currently, 8 families receive recurring support, the banker said. Others receive assistance as situations arise. 8 families. I pictured the small kitchen back in Norfolk where my father had balanced his checkbook every Sunday night. He had been supporting 8 families while living like he barely supported himself. And if I decide to stop? I asked. The banker met my eyes calmly. That decision is legally within your authority. There was no judgment in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. You could dissolve the trust and distribute the funds to the estate if you wished. $12 million. Split between Michael and me, it would change both of our lives overnight. No more mortgages. No more work deadlines. No more worrying about retirement accounts. The thought crossed my mind the way it probably crosses anyone's mind when they suddenly hear a number like that. But it didn't stay long. Because every page in front of me carried my father's signature. 20 years of quiet decisions. 20 years of choosing discipline over comfort. I closed the folder slowly. "He didn't build this so it could disappear," I said. The banker nodded once, almost like he had expected that answer. "There is one more item," he said. From inside the folder, he pulled a sealed envelope and slid it across the desk toward me. The paper looked older than the rest of the documents. "Your father left this with us when the trust was established," he explained. "It was to be given to you only after his death." I picked it up carefully. My name was written across the front in the same block handwriting I had seen on the trust documents. For a moment, I didn't open it. I just held it there, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Because up until that moment, everything I had learned about my father had come from numbers and paperwork. This was the first time I was about to hear from him directly. I finally broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first line stopped me cold. "If you're reading this," he had written, "then I didn't get the chance to explain it in person." I sat there in that quiet Geneva office, $12 million in documents spread across the desk, realizing something I hadn't fully understood when the general spoke to me at Arlington. My father hadn't just left behind money. He had left instructions. And somehow he trusted me to carry them out. I finished reading my father's letter twice before I folded it back into the envelope. The handwriting was exactly the way I remembered it from when I was a kid. Block letters, steady, no wasted space. The message itself was just as direct. He didn't apologize for the trust. He didn't try to justify the money. He simply explained why he built it. Some of the men he had served with were struggling. Medical problems, families falling apart, benefits running out. He had watched it happen quietly over the years. So he started setting money aside. Little by little. "Don't advertise help," he wrote. "Just provide it." By the time I left the bank in Geneva that afternoon, the air along the lake felt colder than it had that morning. Not because of the weather. Because I knew the conversation waiting for me back home. Michael. I didn't call him that night. The flight back to Virginia gave me 9 quiet hours to think about how to explain something that wasn't really meant to be explained. When I landed in Norfolk, the sky looked wide and familiar again. I drove straight to Dad's house. Michael's truck was already in the driveway. Of course it was. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, a legal pad in front of him and a pen tapping lightly against the paper. "You move fast," I said. He didn't smile. "I called a lawyer," he said. I set my briefcase down on the table. I figured. Michael leaned back in the chair, studying my face. "So?" he said. "What did you find?" I opened the folder slowly and laid the documents on the table between us. "It's a trust," I said. "For what?" "For veterans and their families." Michael frowned. "That's charity. It's responsibility." He leaned forward slightly. "And how much are we talking about?" I hesitated for half a second. 12 million. The pen stopped tapping. Michael blinked. $12 million? Yes. He let out a low whistle and leaned back again. Jesus. For a moment, he just stared at the table. Then he looked up. "And how much of that do we get?" I met his eyes. "It's not structured that way." "What do you mean it's not structured that way?" "It's a trust," I said again. "The funds are designated for specific purposes." Michael's expression hardened. "So he left $12 million sitting in Switzerland and didn't leave his own son anything?" "He helped you plenty of times," I said quietly. "That was loans." "Yes. That's different." The room went quiet. Michael stood up and walked to the sink, staring out the kitchen window toward the backyard fence Dad had repaired every spring. "So you control it now?" he asked. "Yes." "And you're telling me you can't just divide it?" "I could dissolve it," I said carefully. Michael turned around immediately. "Well, there you go." "But that would destroy what he built." Michael laughed once, short and sharp. "What he built? Support for people who needed it." "And I don't need it?" he said. "That's not what I said." He walked back to the table and leaned over it. You're sitting on $12 million and telling me it belongs to strangers? It belongs to the trust. He shook his head slowly. You always did know how to make yourself sound righteous. That's not what this is. It sure feels like it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Michael picked up the folder and flipped through the documents quickly. I'm going to talk to a lawyer, he said. I nodded. I figured you would. He looked up at me, his eyes colder now than when I walked in. You're really not going to bend on this? No. Michael closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. Then I guess we'll let a judge decide. He grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door. Right before he stepped outside, he stopped and looked back at me. You're choosing strangers over your own brother, he said. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied. I'm choosing what Dad built. Michael didn't slam the door when he left. That almost made it worse. The house just went quiet again, the same quiet it had been since Dad died. The clock on the kitchen wall kept ticking, steady and indifferent, like nothing important had happened. But something had. 3 weeks later, the paperwork arrived. Not dramatic. No angry phone calls, no shouting matches in the driveway. Just a certified envelope delivered by a process server who looked like he'd done the same thing 1,000 times before. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Petition to contest the trust. Legal language has a way of turning family into categories. Petitioner. Respondent. Assets. Claims. Michael's attorney argued that the Swiss trust had been structured improperly, that our father had failed to disclose the full extent of his foreign assets, that the arrangement unfairly limited Michael's access to what he believed should have been family inheritance, undue influence, lack of transparency, failure to distribute assets equally between heirs. The phrases sounded clinical on paper, but every line carried the same message. Michael wanted the trust opened. He wanted the money divided. I called the attorney whose name the Swiss banker had given me, Richard Hayes. His office was in Norfolk, about 15 minutes from the house. Gray hair, Navy veteran, calm voice. The kind of man who listened more than he talked. He read through the documents slowly. When he finished, he set the papers down and folded his hands. Your father was thorough, he said. That's good? That's very good. I leaned back in the chair. Michael thinks he can break the trust. Richard shook his head slightly. He can challenge it, he said. Anyone can challenge anything in court. But from what I see here, the trust was established 20 years ago. Properly documented, properly funded. He tapped the folder once. Courts tend to respect that kind of preparation. The first hearing happened about a month later. The courtroom in Norfolk wasn't anything like the dramatic ones people imagine from television. No polished wood panels or dramatic speeches, just beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a handful of people waiting for their own cases to be called. Michael sat at the opposite table. He looked tired. When our case was called, his attorney stood and began outlining their argument. The trust had allegedly been structured in a way that limited Michael's rightful inheritance. The assets were international. The documentation had not been fully disclosed during probate. Richard responded calmly. The trust predates any alleged conflict by more than 2 decades, he said. It was legally established, referenced in the decedent's will, and maintained consistently. The judge listened without interrupting. No raised voices, no drama, just questions. Documentation, dates. The judge requested additional records from the Swiss office and scheduled another hearing. Outside the courtroom, Michael finally spoke to me. You could end this today, he said. How? Split it. It's not mine to split. It's $12 million, he said. Nobody would know. I looked at him for a moment. That's not true. What do you mean? Dad would know. Michael shook his head slowly. You're making him into something bigger than he was. No, I said quietly. I'm finally understanding who he was. The second hearing brought more paperwork. Swiss certifications, investment records, distribution histories, 20 years of steady contributions. Richard handled everything with the calm patience of someone who had seen families fracture before. The third hearing lasted less than 30 minutes, After reviewing the documentation, the judge adjusted her glasses and spoke clearly. "The trust is legally valid," she said. "There is no evidence of undue influence or improper structuring." She paused. "The petition to dissolve the trust is dismissed." No dramatic gavel. No applause. Just one word. Dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Michael stood beside his truck staring at the pavement. "You really weren't going to bend," he said. "No." He nodded slowly. Then he looked up at me. I guess Dad knew exactly who to trust. He got in his truck and drove away. And for the first time since opening that folder in Geneva, I realized something important. Winning the case didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility becoming permanent. For a few days after the hearing, the house felt different, not peaceful, just quiet in a way that made every small sound noticeable. The refrigerator humming, the wind moving through the trees outside, the old clock in the hallway marking every second like it was keeping track of something important. Winning in court hadn't solved anything. It had only settled the paperwork. Michael didn't call. No texts. No emails. Just silence. In some ways, that was easier than arguing. In other ways, it felt heavier. I kept working through the documents with the Swiss office. Quarterly distributions were scheduled the same way my father had arranged them. Medical assistance for a retired Marine in Arizona. Tuition payments for 2 children whose father had been injured years earlier during a deployment. Life went on. The trust did exactly what it had been designed to do. Steady. A week after the ruling, Richard Hayes called. "Just one more update," he said. "What kind?" "The court has formally closed the petition." "So that's it?" "That's it. No appeals. No new filings. The legal challenge was finished. The trust stood exactly where my father had built it 20 years earlier. Later that afternoon, I drove over to Richard's office to sign a few final documents. His office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the kind of place where time moved slower than the outside world. He slid the last form across the desk. "Once this is filed, the court recognizes you as the acting trustee without dispute." I signed my name. The ink looked darker than I expected against the white paper. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You handled this well," he said. "I didn't feel like I handled anything," I replied. "You didn't react emotionally. That doesn't mean it was easy." He gave a small nod. "It never is when family is involved." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that stuck with me longer than the legal victory itself. "Money doesn't break families," he said. "It reveals them." I thought about that all the way back to my father's house. When I walked inside, the place looked exactly the same as it always had. The same worn couch, the same kitchen table where Dad used to sit every Sunday morning with a crossword puzzle and a cup of coffee. Nothing about the room suggested that $12 million had just survived a legal battle. Later that night, curiosity finally got the better of me. I went to the hallway closet and opened the small safe I had found weeks earlier while sorting through Dad's belongings. Inside were only 3 things. A folded American flag from a ceremony years ago. A photograph of my father standing beside 3 other men. All of them smiling the way soldiers do when the camera catches them off guard. And a small piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. 2 words written in the same block handwriting I had seen on every trust document. "Steady wins." That was it. No speech. No explanation. Just those 2 words. I sat there at the kitchen table for a long time staring at that note. The court had confirmed the trust was valid. The lawyers had closed the case. But sitting there in that quiet house, I understood something deeper than the legal ruling. My father hadn't just trusted the courts to protect what he built. He had trusted me to protect it, too. And that responsibility wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the same way he had lived his entire life. Quiet. Consistent. Steady. About a year after the court dismissed Michael's case, we stood together at Arlington again. Not because anyone asked us to. Because it felt right. The headstone looked exactly the same as it had the day of the funeral, clean white marble, simple lettering, nothing extra. Dad had never cared much for decoration. The wind moved through the rows of flags the same way it always does there, steady and quiet. Michael stood beside me with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Over the past 12 months, something about him had changed. Not dramatically, just small things. His shoulders weren't as tense. His voice didn't carry the same sharp edge. He had finished his first year of financial counseling, paid off nearly half the debt that had been hanging over him for years, sold the second truck he didn't really need, closed the credit lines that used to feel like lifelines. He hadn't become perfect, He had become steady. The trust continued to run exactly the way Dad designed it. Quarterly medical payments went out on schedule. 2 kids of one of Dad's old teammates started college that fall. A widow in Texas kept her house because her mortgage had quietly been brought current. No press releases. No ceremonies. Just steady help. Michael looked down at the headstone for a long moment. "I used to think he was holding out on us," he said. "He was holding something," I replied. "Just not what we thought." Michael nodded slowly. "Do you ever wish you'd just split it?" he asked. "No." He studied my face for a moment. "Even after everything?" "Especially after everything." That earned the smallest smile I had seen from him in a long time. Before we left, he cleared his throat. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About him. About you." I nodded. "I know." We walked back toward the parking lot together, and for the first time since my father's funeral, it felt like his legacy wasn't dividing us anymore. It was finally doing exactly what he intended, holding things steady. True legacy is rarely loud. The people who shape our lives most often do it quietly through discipline, consistency, and values they practice every day. This story reminds us that wealth is not always measured in what we spend or display, but in what we build for others over time. The father lived modestly, yet he spent decades preparing help for people who needed it most. In life, many of the most meaningful contributions happen without recognition. If there is a lesson here, it is this: live steadily, act with integrity, and build something that outlasts you. The greatest inheritance we leave behind is not money, but responsibility and character.